Okay, it's 2 o'clock. So we will get started. I'm Christine Shirley with DLCD, but before I start the presentation, I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Matt Kroll.
Hi, I'm Matt Kroll, the Planning Services Division Manager here at the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I'm glad to see folks here today to look at this risk assessment. And I know some of you definitely recognize the names. People have been with us for over a year and a half on this project, and have spent a lot of time, dedicated a lot of effort into helping work on this risk assessment. And then we had a big workshop last October and more series of meetings. So I think it's really good where we are at this point. We're getting close to the end. I won't say we're not at the end, but it feels like it's within sight, at least for this statewide version of this risk assessment. Of course, there is a future phase of this project where we will continue making this risk assessment available, more usable for tribes, counties, cities, special districts. But I think we're closing in on getting this statewide risk assessment. So it's good to see people here today to go over where we are and answer any questions you have and gather any final feedback on it.
Can you introduce Stephen, please?
Yeah, Stephen Richardson, go ahead, tell us your role and your.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for those that are able to make it. My name is Stephen Richardson. I'm the Mitigation Section Manager and also serve as the State's Hazard Mitigation Officer for the Oregon Department of Emergency Management. And just want to thank everyone again for the time. This plan is really important to us and the work we do as a statewide mitigation strategy. It helps inform the grant funding that we get from our FEMA partners and being able to accomplish mitigation actions. But that all starts with being able to identify risk and those hazards that are in your areas. And so super excited for this. For folks who don't know, Oregon has a 4-volume comprehensive emergency management plan, and the hazard mitigation plan for the state is volume number 1. And this feeds into all the other volumes and work that we do here at Oregon Emergency Management. So look forward to the discussions. Thank you so much for everyone showing up.
Kirsten, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Thank you. Stephen's a hard act to follow. We wouldn't be here without OEM, but thank you, everybody. I'm Kirsten Green. I'm the Deputy Director at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I also serve as our tribal liaison and supporter and fan of this emerging work. I appreciate being able to showcase this update. Maybe Tricia.
Hi, Tricia Patterson. I'm a natural hazard mitigation planner here at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Chris and I are colleagues on this risk assessment development.
Great. And I see that we have 19 people attending as attendees. So I think what we will do is promote you all into the panelist area later so that you can actually converse with us, because right now you will not be able to talk directly to us. So I'm going to go through.
Yep, Chris, that's also awesome. People can raise their hand and we can allow them to speak either way. But yeah, they can speak from attendee mode as well. Either way. Thanks.
Okay. But we have to allow the talking. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is go over the basic structure of the natural hazards risk assessment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the risk assessment itself. I'm assuming that you can read it. But I wanted to give you an orientation to the whys and wherefores of it and how it's structured. That's my intent today. Can you advance the slide, please? So our agenda today is to review the risk assessment purpose, its assumptions, the approach we took, go through the document structure, and share the modeling results, not so much the results, but the elements of the results so that you can review them on your own, because there are a lot of results. And then we have some key questions that we would like you to consider as you review the document. And of course, if you have other questions, it's fine too, but we are interested in hearing your feedback on some sort of big picture questions. So that's what we'll be doing. So the questions I'm going to put up front, and then we'll revisit them at the end. We want to know if the risk assessment is achieving its goal of providing actionable information. What do you like? We're taking a new approach, so we're interested in what you think of this approach, what you appreciate about it, and what you don't. What would make it easier to understand? Do you see anything missing, and do you have any concerns? So we'll be coming back to those questions later on in the hour, but I wanted to put them out there for you now so that you can think on them as we go through the slides. So a risk assessment is a key element of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan, and FEMA has some specific requirements necessary for a risk assessment. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the basic idea is that they want the risk assessment to identify critical facilities, state-owned buildings, and risks to people. That's for the state risk assessment. And the current guidance suggests or mandates that we include potential risk to socially vulnerable populations. So we took this sort of vague requirement and turned it into some specific requirements for ourselves. Of course, we need to comply with FEMA guidance so that the plan can be approved by FEMA. We wanted to identify places that, because of characteristics of their populations, infrastructure, economy, culture, and governance, are most at risk due to natural hazard events. And you'll note that some of those categories, economic, cultural, and governance, are not listed on the FEMA requirement side. So we are expanding our risk assessment to include more elements of risk. And we wanted to include or to create a system that's usable by state agencies, local governments, and tribes. And right now, the risk assessment is focused on the state plan, but we have a future phase 2 that will make the information available on a GIS environment. And we also wanted a system or a risk assessment that's reproducible and is not as dependent as the last one was on expert opinion, which varies by who's in the room. So we're using data that can be reproduced and maintained. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, a couple of disclaimers before we get started. The risk assessment helps identify general areas where mitigation projects might be needed, but it does not change the criteria for projects. It does not change how we allocate the funds. It's just a piece of information to help us zero in on areas that may benefit from mitigation. Also, the risk assessment is not regulatory. It doesn't replace or usurp any local, state, or federal regulatory programs. It's information. Okay, I can't see anyone's hand, so if someone can be monitoring that, that would be really helpful. All right.
Monitoring that, and we're good so far.
Great, thank you. So the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan risk assessment has some basic assumptions. But before I go into that, I just want to clarify something. I'm going to talk about the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan risk assessment and the Oregon Natural Hazard Risk Assessment model. They're two different things. And sometimes when we say risk assessment, it gets mixed up in our minds that they're actually two separate things. So at this moment, I'm talking about the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan itself. So our assumptions are that hazard mitigation planning enhances community resilience. So we want to make sure that we're capturing the elements that build resilience. Key is that we believe it is assumed in the plan that underserved and under-resourced communities suffer more from natural hazard events, even if that event is less damaging than it would be in a more resourced community. And finally, our assumption is that risk of harm is multifaceted. It includes much more than just damage to buildings, agricultural losses, monetary damage associated with death and injuries. It really needs to include potential long-term disruption to lives, livelihoods, and financial stability. So we tried to include elements that touch on those livelihood and stability indicators or elements. All right, so some of our goals for the assessment were to enhance existing tools, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the FEMA National Risk Index in a moment. We wanted to employ a multi-criteria decision support system that reflects multiple types of vulnerabilities. Like I said, the multifaceted vulnerabilities to hazard events, and that is flexible enough to reflect local conditions when we get to phase 2. We wanted to maintain transparency with respect to model inputs. And the reason why I say that is because many of you are familiar with indexes that come from various organizations that come up with a final number, and it's really hard sometimes to figure out what the values of the underlying indicators that went into those indexes are. And we wanted to provide actionable information for state, local, and tribal users and special districts, as Matt mentioned. Okay, we can go on. All right. So the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan Risk Assessment chapter follows a general outline by hazard, where we start the chapter with some general information that refers to all of the hazards. But then for each hazard, we have an updated hazard characterization, a narrative written by a subject matter expert. Then we display the FEMA National Risk Index, which reports expected monetary losses to buildings, insured agriculture, and loss of life or injury to people based on historic events. And then we enhance that NRI with the Oregon Natural Hazards Risk Assessment Model that incorporates that broader range of socioeconomic indicators of vulnerability. And then finally, in the chapter where it's appropriate, we visualize and discuss some climate change effects and how those might affect the risk of harm from natural hazard events. So in order to do the Oregon Natural Hazard Risk Assessment Model, we wanted to, as I said, use a multi-criteria decision support method model. And we chose a version of that called Promethi. Promethi allows us to input a wide range of indicators of vulnerability and rank census tracts according to how that set of vulnerabilities interact with each other. We used in our risk assessment proportions of exposed elements, percentages, rather than counts or dollar values, because we have found in doing risk assessments at the local level that if you just use counts and dollar values, you end up finding risk where there are people. And that is important, but it's also important to find places where the proportion of people or buildings that are affected is high, and therefore there's that would indicate a oh, my brain just went dead. That would indicate that a large proportion of, or large part of the city or county area census tract is affected by the hazard. So they feel it more strongly. The output of the model is a ranked list of census tracts by hazard type, ordered from most at risk to least. And the rankings represent areas for further investigation. The ranking that comes out of the model doesn't tell you the magnitude of difference between the different census tracts. So we can't just say, oh, you're number 1, so you're a lot more at risk than number 10 or number 50. So it really just gives us a list to start working down to discover areas that might benefit from mitigation. And the high rank, I'm not done yet. The we oh, we might be, no, the previous one. Okay. The high ranking, as I said, represent areas for further investigation. And the output from the model also allows us to dig deeper into what is driving risk in those areas. And later on, I will show you the tools that we can use to do that deeper dive. Okay, now we can move on. So the first part of the hazard-specific information in the risk assessment is the narrative. So the narratives are several pages long. They go into great detail about the nature, extent, probability, previous events, a lot of detail about the hazard itself. That narrative is followed by the National Risk Index map, our Promethi ranking map, and a climate change map. And then at the end of the risk assessment, there's an appendix that provides more information to help us discover more information about the census tracts ranked the highest in our model. We pulled out the top 10 census tracts, which is rather arbitrary, but it resulted in 90 different census tracts that were at risk for various hazards, and that was about all we could manage. But it's really just an example of the kinds of information that's available from the model. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so this is an example of a map from the National Risk Index. We used the risk index rating from the NRI, which has it ranges from very low to very high. In the ranking is based on national percentiles. So that's why in this particular map, you can see that we only have very low, relatively low, and relatively moderate risk ratings, because on a national scale, that's how it fell out. So that's one of the disadvantages of the National Risk Index, is that it is based on national percentiles. And so it sometimes washes out local nuances. I'm going to say a little bit more about the National Risk Index and why we didn't use it exclusively for our Oregon Natural Hazard Risk Assessment. It has some limitations, and because it monetizes losses. So it only looks at buildings, losses to agriculture, and death and injury, and monetizes those losses to do the ranking, to do the percentiles. It does not cover other things like damage to pipes and sewage treatment plants and water treatment plants and parks, and the inconvenience and financial losses of the people who aren't injured or are dead, but their lives are disrupted. It does not capture any of that. It doesn't take into account bridges and roads. So it's really a limited look at risk from the perspective of FEMA wanting to know where they're likely to spend the most money for mitigation. So we needed to supplement the National Risk Index with something a little more nuanced. So we can go to the next slide, which shows our Promethi results from or drought. We have these results for 9 different hazards. We were not able to model all 11 natural hazards and dams because we didn't have enough information for winter storm and windstorms, but we were able to model 9 of the hazards. And the maps show, we have 2 sets of maps coming out of our model. One shows just the hazard itself without the socioeconomic elements included. And then a second map shows the same hazards, but with the socioeconomic elements included. Now, first of all, I recognize that the color scheme on this is not great, and we are planning to fix that in the final. But when you're reviewing these Promethi maps, you'll see a table next to the map itself that has a lot of words in it that you probably can't see here. There's a key in the risk assessment itself that tells you what these fields are. But these are the fields listed next to the map that were used for the analysis for that hazard. Every hazard has a different set of indicators. So there is a core set of socioeconomic indicators that are used for all of the maps, and those are labeled general on these tables. But the ones that are not labeled general are unique to the hazard that is being evaluated. It's also important to note that the general category was weighted at 65%, and the hazard specific categories were were weighted at 35. And that was done because of one of our main objectives of the Oregon risk assessment was to illuminate the socioeconomic vulnerabilities that were not taken into account in the National Risk Index. And so yeah, those are the Promethi maps. Are there any questions about these? And we can certainly come back to slides if you do have questions. So the next map in the Gerald has his hand up.
Yep.
Yeah. Can someone
Hi.
make him? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I just have a question here that's been bothering me pretty much through this whole process that I've taken part in. And this really developed over a community wildfire resilience gathering I had this weekend, put on by Oregon State University and State Fire Marshal's office. We had a visitor from the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Security discussing defensive zones for homes and materials that were non-combustible for future construction, to make more resilient neighborhoods in these high wildfire areas. But I see as a planning commissioner with Clackamas County, I see a real conflict with what the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety requirements or recommendations are with things like middle housing. This is just one factor I'm going with as far as, middle housing allows development of multi-units on a single family zoned lot now. So you could have a duplex, triplex, quadplex, or cottage living if, or cottage homes in a village setup, but you wouldn't have the setbacks that are being recommended by the insurance industry. Shouldn't the insurance industry be involved with this planning, since they are basically dictating what future development is going to happen? And so I kind of struggle with this because of Measure 49 also, we have something coming at us about floodplain developments and new setbacks due to the Endangered Species Act and FEMA requirements. So the mapping of these, I see, are we able to use these maps for our planning purposes? I'm really questioning this.
Mhm. I appreciate the comment. Maybe a different set of maps is needed for the kinds of questions that you're asking. And the beauty of the model, the Promethi model that we're using, is it's very flexible in terms of what inputs you put into it. You can use the model with any inputs that you care to use. And once we get to phase 2, it will be our intention is to make it possible for users to put their own indicators into the model. So, but I do appreciate the disconnect with the insurance requirements and the middle housing requirements.
Yeah, Chris, could I just add a commendation to Mr. Murphy for serving on a county planning commission? No wonder you see things so holistically. So thank you. But Chris, that it is a great point, and we welcome others to comment in writing or in the form that's on the website. But this is helpful to know what kind of disclaimers and or points we could put in the revised version. So indeed, that's a good one. Like, what are, is this these not necessarily at a scale to inform zoning dishes, zoning and setback decisions. But sir, thank you for thinking about all those things. You can't help it with the role that you carry. But thank you.
Yeah, and please don't take this as just criticism. This is
No, it's good. No, it's really helpful because obviously our agency is involved with middle housing regulations as well. So we're listening. That's why I had to pop on camera and say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me take part in this.
Yeah, that's great. And then Matt, do you want to note what you've put in the chat here as well, sir?
So I just want to just be absolutely clear so that nobody gets confused here, that the maps we're working with here are not the maps that are going to have anything to do with defensible space requirements, any of the rules. This is not the wildfire hazard map that controls that. These are the census tract levels. So you can't look on these maps and find your house on these maps. It's covering a whole neighborhood of, typically 1,000, 5,000 or more people in each census tract. So, and the kind of things you're talking about, Murph, are very important, but they're going to be very site specific, and you're really going to have to work with the city or the county, in your case, on that site and to look at what's the zoning and the specific details of what the dimensions and the vegetation on that site. It'd be nice if, I don't know if it'd be nice. We certainly didn't get to that level of detail in these maps.
One more comment on this. I got involved with this because I was able to design, permit, and build riverbank stabilization projects without any engineering degrees after the 2011 flood in my neighborhood. And when I started looking into this, I did come to meetings complaining about this. How come I can do this? We don't have a template that we're following for our reaches or our river sides. Is there any law that dictates what can be built? And there definitely is, but there was nothing that brought everything together. We worked on this and we finally had come up with an analysis of what the upper Sandy River should look like. But as I started looking at other hazards within the area, we're built on a lahar. And according to this report, the lahar is basically a hazard when it's being created. It's also a hazard as we build on it because it is something that's still moving. It's only been there for, in the Sandy River, the latest lahar is less than 300 years old. We have development on this. You hydrate this like the current storms we have right now with a high water event going on, and you have liquefaction of the banks. And this is just a natural process. You can't prevent it. This is something that has to happen. that, or, there's no way we're going to change this environment. But we can prevent damage by starting to limit the amount of development within these areas up against a known hazard. I also have a Slido map that says that we're in a slide zone besides a wildfire and channel migration zones and earthquake zone and fireplace zones. We're allowing development in these areas without, I think, proper evacuation routes, without communications, which we're working on right now. But we need to pay attention to this. And I'm sorry to take off on this, but this is why I show up at your meetings.
Yeah, of course. So Murph, if you can look at the volcano section of the risk assessment, the narrative part, if
Yes.
it does not mention the liquefaction potential, can you make a comment about that in the
Absolutely.
official record?
Yes, I will. And I will refer to the analysis that has been done of this area by
Thank you.
Natural Systems Design back in 2013, along with Clyde.
Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you.
You betcha.
I just have to say thank you, Murph. These are great factors to consider, but I have to be absolutely clear. Our maps are not to that level of detail that anybody can be using to regulate development on. We're trying to get sort of an overview statewide to help hone in on areas that might be worth further investigation. But if you or the county wants to do some kind of development restrictions or development standards, that's a great idea. But you're going to need to do a lot more detailed mapping on your specific piece of property. The maps that we're doing here just don't even get anywhere nearly close to that level of detail.
Well, Matt,
So-
like I said, I've been working on this since the 2011 flood, and I've been working under the Silver Jacket program with Oregon Solutions. I've been working under the flood risk management committee that was developed here in my neighborhood, basically for trying to figure out ways to live with this river. The county will not make a stance. It cannot afford to say you cannot develop on these properties and these properties need to be condemned. We asked the state, I stood in front of state legislatures and asked them.
So this is a lot of good stuff, but I think we need to kind of work on our overview and look at this risk assessment. And maybe if there's another time that we want to talk about some of the specifics on your river.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry to have to move on, but we need to make
No,
sure we
I know.
cover everything here.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So great. Following those Promethi maps is a climate change map where it is appropriate, where there is a climate change nexus. We contracted with the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute to provide us with some downscaled and very detailed information about climate hazards by census tract. And the maps that are in the risk assessment consolidate that information into biteable chunks so that you don't have to look at the large spreadsheets. So we classified the level of change in these maps to map them so that you can see where changes are most likely to occur or where the changes are the biggest. These maps will be supplemented with a climate change chapter that has not been published for review yet, that has much more detailed information. These are really cartoons just to help us zero in on areas that are likely to see large changes, and then you can compare them with the Promethi maps and see where maybe some mitigation opportunities exist. So those are the maps that are in the risk assessment chapters for each hazard. All right, so as I mentioned, the Promethi model outputs a ranked list of census tract by hazard that you can look at for to learn more. And one of the model outputs that are demonstrated in the appendix of the risk assessment are the top 10 ranked census tracts by hazard, and this chart that shows z-scores for the individual indicators that went into that analysis. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time walking you through what these charts mean. They are available for all of the census tracts, but we can't publish all of them in a printed document because there are just way too many of them. We have 9 hazards and 1,000 census tracts. So our intention is to put these charts into a GIS environment so you can click on a census tract and bring them up in the future. But what these mean are it shows the indicators that were used to evaluate the hazard, and then the bars show the Z-score, which is how far away, how many standard deviations away the indicator is from normal. Okay, so if it's between -1 and 1, the indicator is pretty much in line with other areas of the state, and this is evaluated statewide. If the blue lines go over the -1 or +1 or -1, it means that it's either well above or well below the statewide average. So every census tract has a different pattern of how these indicators interact with each other and how far above or below the mean they are, or whether they're right in line. So in this case, we can see that for this hazard, it's an earthquake hazard. The earthquake, the National Risk Assessment says there's going to be a lot of buildings damaged in the earthquake, and there will be a large population affected. It also says that the shaking is much higher than average, statewide average. And again, there's a key for all these coded indicators in the plan. It's telling us that there's a high percentage of mobile homes in the area, and that there's a social vulnerability component that's a little bit higher than statewide average. So by looking, and then we can look at these other elements, which are basically neighborliness, and which is the watch, favors, advice, parties, and visits. And you can also see that the county tax rate is significantly lower than the rest of the state. So by looking at these scores and this collection of indicators for this hazard in this census tract, you can begin to develop a story of what's going on in this area. And that can help you come up with appropriate mitigation actions. So, for example, here we know that there are a lot of buildings that are likely to be damaged, but we know that the county tax rates are very low, and so we know that we may need to do some technical support to do mitigation projects in that area. Whereas in another area where the county tax rates are high, you might not have to supply as much technical support. So every one of the census tracts and every one of the hazards shows a different pattern of these blue bars, and it's really fascinating to study them. I just want to say one more thing about this. The other part of the Promethi model that is helpful is that the input indicators retain their units of measure, so they don't become obscured by being a percentile or some other unit of measure that's hard to decipher. If you look at the Promethi output tables, you can actually see exactly what unit of measure they're talking about. And so it just makes the data easier to understand and more transparent.
We just got a comment from Daniel in the chat. Daniel, if you're able to come off mute, or I can read your question. It's about the inclusion of these charts, which yes, they will be included in the subsequent report.
Well, in the risk assessment itself, we can only include the top 10 for each hazard. But when we do a GIS environment later on, we will display these for all of the census tracts and for all of the hazards. But you can imagine a 9,000 page appendix is not going to be appreciated by users.
Yeah, I just was taking a look at the list here and with the abbreviations and such, having at least some explanatory statements that says, okay, that's what this thing actually means. And by seeing the chart being this far here, that means that it's above average, which can mean this, right? So when we are looking at presenting this information out there, either via a dashboard or report, something that indicates, yep, this helps me to understand what that particular piece means.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It's a little terse right now. So thank you for that. So getting back to our list of questions that we are interested in, and I know you probably have questions that for yourselves. We would like to open the floor to have some conversation about whether this risk assessment is actually achieving the goal of providing actionable information, whether you like the approach and why, what would make it easier to use and understand, and Daniel just brought up one of them. And did you see anything missing? And I already know of a couple of things that are missing. You might notice that the wildfire section is not in the review draft at this time. And that's because we needed to make some tweaks to it and not interfere with the review period for the wildfire risk hazard maps that are ongoing from forestry. And do you have any concerns about the approach and why? So I'm like to open the floor for those kinds of conversations. I see, yeah.
This is Christina Cross from City of Springfield.
Yes, hi.
Hi, so I'm the Assistant City Attorney. My question is on the draft document. I know you said that you're going to release like a GIS version of this later, which is fantastic. My question in reviewing the document to sort of understand what might be missing or if things seem sort of off from local knowledge, would it be possible to publish some of those risk maps zoomed in on metropolitan areas? Because the census tract for, for example, for Springfield, they're so small compared to those versions of the map that you've published that I can't tell, I can't get any helpful information from that map at all. And if you go into the National Risk Index, there's definitely sections that are missing. I think they don't categorize things correctly, I think for our community in some of those census tracts for the National Risk Assessment. So I can't, if I'm concerned about how the Prometheus results are showing that maybe for Springfield, maybe that's different than the National Risk Assessment, but I can't tell.
Okay, so the phase 2 version, well, we have available today Prometheus rankings by city and by county.
Okay.
There's no reason why we can't aggregate by metropolitan area if that would be useful to you.
Well, I think just having access to some of those documents for city or county, and maybe our emergency manager already has that information, but I'm not finding it. I wasn't finding it on DLCD's website for how to find.
We haven't published that information in this state risk assessment yet.
Okay.
But I do appreciate how it would be useful. The census tracts do get really small in metropolitan areas.
Okay, and then my second question, you already talked about I had a question about the wildfire part, since part of it's there, but it doesn't have the mapping, doesn't seem as complete. My other question is the dam safety information doesn't have, unless I missed it, doesn't have all of the same risk assessment results. Are there going to be updates to that dam safety section?
Correct. The dam safety section did not go through the Prometheus ranking system.
Okay.
And that was partly because we weren't able to create a nice list of indicators to run through the system. So, yes, the dam safety section does not have the same set of maps that or the dam risk section that the other hazards has.
And you don't plan to do that in this round?
Not in this round.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. That's all.
Further context might be helpful here as well, Christina, is that high hazard potential dams are a new requirement from FEMA, and they have slightly different guidance. So we tailored that section to that guidance.
Mm-hmm.
It's a unique hazard.
Yeah. Do we have other people who want to come off mute? And we'd prefer that you talk to us rather than using the chat so that it's easier to see. I
Yeah,
see.
so this is Daniel again from OEM.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, one of the other contexts for making things easier to understand or use, I do like how FEMA has designed their National Risk Index interactive map. So if you are looking at publishing this as an interactive GIS service, having that explanation for how the risk index was calculated and kind of the overall layout of, oh, taking a look at that bar chart and converting that into, oh, this is what it actually means, right? This is high compared to the rest of the state, helps provide that additional context. So at a glance, when I'm taking a look and I want to see information about a jurisdiction or an area that I'm concerned with, having that at a glance look that is easy to read and interpret and understand, and helps me to determine, oh, this is how they calculated that value, helps me to further know how to use that information. So if I'm looking at publishing this in other applications that help, reinforce the state's assessment capability and interacts with other, data that we may have that talks about what's in a given area, right? We have a consistent message that we are providing. And especially, I do really like the bottom line, even if it's a simple mathematical formula of, it's this plus this times that equals this, right? And just thinking about taking that same approach to all of the different hazard types. You have the ability to switch between the different hazards, maybe. Just some suggestions that I have on how you might visualize and display that data.
Thank you. Yes. I see Trina's hand up. I think you're off mute now.
But we're having trouble hearing you if your audio isn't coming in.
Yeah, we're not hearing you, Trina. Okay.
In the meantime, Chris, do you mind taking up Philip's question? He's doesn't have a voice today.
Okay.
So it's in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, it's in the chat.
I can read it to you, Chris. It's please provide an explanation of the caveats of how this was developed with respect to the dollar value, et cetera, and how this is taken into account.
Yes, so we took into account the percentage of infrastructure elements exposed and the percentage of people exposed. We did not take into account dollar amounts. And the reason for that was the National Risk Index does an excellent job of that. And we did, in some cases, pull in from the National Risk Index, the expected annual loss rate. But we did not pull in the dollar loss values. So if you want dollar loss values, the NRI is a great place to go. So these risk assessments, they work together. It's not one or the other. So does that answer your question?
He says, okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, we could not replicate the level of detail that's with respect to dollar losses that's provided in the National Risk Index. So, just use both of them.
Oh, Christine, this is Daniel again.
Uh-huh.
When taking a look at, the infrastructure impacts in a given area, are you guys also kind of calculating how many of these are in that general area? So I know you talked a little bit about the percentage piece, but now let's just say something happens in a given area and it impacts the only hospital that is within 100 miles of that particular jurisdiction. How is that calculated with the Prometheus model?
Well, with respect to hospitals, we do have an indicator about distance to the nearest hospital. That's one of the indicators. With respect to other types of infrastructure, like a wastewater treatment plant or a water treatment plant, we did use percentages within that census tract under the assumption that those are locally facilities are used that are more local. They're not regional, that assumption may not hold up very well in areas with really small census tracts.
Right.
It's something that we should take into consideration.
Yeah, and I was thinking, along the lines of hospitals or health and social services, right? If
Yes.
there are certain things that are in a given area and that is the only means for people to be able to recover from these types of disasters or hazard impacts, that how are those kind of being ranked in combination with everything else? So don't want to delve too much into theory there, but just was thinking about that piece.
Yeah. So with respect to the health facilities, like I said, we did use as an indicator the distance to a full service hospital and the number of beds available in that hospital. So we have 2 health indicators, and those are in our general category, and they apply to all hazards.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Are we able to hear Trina?
No, you're not coming through for me.
Would this be a good time to plug the Thursday evening opportunity?
Sure. See what time it is. Yes, we're coming to the close. We will also be having another session of this meeting on Thursday at 6:00. And we chose 6:00 to help bring in folks that may have jobs that will not allow them to participate during the day. So if you have colleagues, friends, neighbors, or others who might benefit from learning more about the structure of the risk assessment as they review it, feel free to share the information about the Thursday night session. And in addition, we are recording this and we'll post it on our DLCD YouTube channel, so you can listen to it again if you want to. And can we go to the next slide? Okay, I'm going to address Trina's question. She says she noticed some errors regarding the National Weather Service extreme heat information. We can pass that along to the subject matter expert that wrote that section. If you are able to be specific about what those errors are in the comments, we can pass those along to the authors. So the best thing to do is to send your comment to this dlcd.nhmp email address so that we can record it as a comment and follow through to get it resolved. All right, so,
You have Rita Dogami with their hand up.
oh, okay. Yes, Reed, go ahead. You're unmuted now.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear
Mhm.
me?
Yep.
Just a couple of questions. One, I was wondering if it's worth symbolizing the z-score plots in a way that shows the difference between factors where a higher number increases the score or factors where a lower number increases the score. Because I think in the case of that earthquake example you showed, there was the one really negative indicator, but that one was actually making that tract look, more positive in its ranking.
Yes, Reed, you do bring up a good point in writing out the key to interpreting these z-scores. Because we wanted to retain the units of measure in each of the indicators, sometimes an indicator is positive, it means it's more vulnerable, and if it's negative, it means it's less vulnerable. Or sometimes it's the opposite way around. So in drafting that key to interpreting the z-scores, we do need to pay careful attention to that.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could use different colors or something to show which ones are
Different colors, good
pushing
idea.
it up versus down. One other question about the process is, there's in the Prometheus analysis, there's not a weighting of the different indicators, and in some cases there's, like in the earthquake example, there's multiple indicators related to liquefaction hazard, and so there's sort of an effective weighting. And there's also things like some factors, like I was noticing in the example you showed today, that the one factor that was making a big difference in that tract was peak ground acceleration and the 2,500 year recurrence map, and that variable varies over a whole order of magnitude or more in the input data, where some of these things are just much coarser. And there are things like, for example, like lumping things into like number of buildings in a like medium to very high hazard or something. You're like not retaining the information we have about where the hazards are higher versus sort of moderate in many cases. And it seems like there could be another strategy where you could basically just, when you're coming up with these scores, weight by things like, is it in the like very high tsunami hazard zone or the moderate sort of zone, and there's a lot of just kind of lumping that is implemented in the current analysis. So I don't know if it'll make a big difference if we were to retain more nuance and information that exists, but I guess that would be my recommendation if there is interest in changing the scoring a little bit.
Right, for some of the hazards that have distinct zones, we did, the indicator does say percent of buildings in that zone. I don't
Right.
know if it does that for earthquake because that's a more diffuse hazard. But for example, flood is definitely more parsed out to be, is the percentage of buildings in the flood zone itself. Same with tsunami.
Yeah, but again, I think the tsunami zones are just, is it in a tsunami zone? And so, for example, the widest, most kind of conservative tsunami zone is a very unlikely earthquake scenario that's kind of a worst case.
Yes.
Whereas, so there is information about, like, there's there's structures that are built in an area that could be inundated by a distant tsunami from Alaska or something that would be a much, those structures are much more likely to get impacted by a tsunami of any size than things that are at the very, uphill end
Yeah.
of the zone that's would take a worst case event.
Yes,
So
I take your point, and that's something that we can talk about, being a little more nuanced about that.
yeah, okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity to provide feedback. And it's an impressive effort overall. So kudos for all that you've done.
Thanks. So we are at time. I think that's all we have for today. You please, if you have any questions or if something comes to mind and you want to talk to us about it, email me. I'll take phone calls. And if I don't know the answer, I can pass you along to the right person. The risk assessment was produced by a team of people, a very large team of people. So if I can't answer the question, I can point you in the right direction. If you have comments that you'd like to make about the approach to the risk assessment, or if you find errors in it, please use the email address to tell us about that so that we can keep a record. And we will have another batch of natural hazard mitigation plan text to share on March 6th, and it will also include the risk assessment. So you'll have you can use that opportunity if you don't have time to respond by March 6th. Although we would like to get your comments by March 6th so that it can feed into the mitigation strategies. So with that, I think we are adjourned unless somebody has a burning final thought.
Thank you, Chris. I'm gonna go ahead and
Thank you.
stop the recording.
Thank you